Hello, I'm Kimberley Dondo, Digital Content Manager, and welcome to In Conversation With, the podcast series that delves into the world of financial services and brings you face to face with some of the most notable figures in the industry. Listen as we discuss topics that are currently facing the industry and hear from visionary CEOs to disruptive innovators as we bring you a diverse array of voices and perspectives. We'll explore the challenges they faced, the lessons they've learned, and the insights they have to share about the ever-evolving landscape of financial services. Hello and welcome to In Conversation With. I'm Kimberley Dondo, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Richard Bate, partner at Weightmans. Thank you for joining me today, Richard.
Oh, you're very welcome. Lovely to meet you.
So, Richard, can you start off by giving us a bit of background into yourself and how you got started?
Yeah, so I'm a partner at Weightmans, based in Manchester. I started in the traditional route, so I went through university studying law, College of Law, and then I've been a private client lawyer ever since. So pretty dull, but 30 years of private clients.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's dull. I think it's very interesting. But let's start with the basics. Could you explain to our audience what wealth transfer encompasses and why it's essential for our listeners, many of whom are financial advisors?
Yeah, sure. So from a private client lawyer perspective, wealth transfer really is about estate planning. So how money or assets can be transferred in the most appropriate manner to suit the person both making the gift and the recipient. Now that could take the form of inheritance on a death through careful will structuring, or it could be just a lifetime gift, which could be just a simple transfer of cash or the purchase of property or investments in someone else's name. It all, however, involves a redistribution of wealth, which, of course, financial advisors are well placed to help plan for and facilitate, taking account, obviously, of the tax consequences that might flow from that.
Right. And wealth transfer often involves drafting wills and establishing trusts. So what are the most common legal issues or pitfalls you encounter in this process that financial advisors should be aware of?
Okay, well, let's break that down a little bit then and look at wills, which could include creating trusts, of course, and then lifetime trusts. So in terms of wills, I suppose the biggest pitfall, of course, is not having one.
Most people don't.
I know that still the majority of people have not got a will in place, and that's a bit of a shame because a will really is a bedrock of someone's estate planning. And without that, the default rules, which are the intestacy rules, will come into play. But they're just not appropriate for the majority of people. So, for example, the intestacy rules say that if you're married with children, a percentage of your estate goes to your children, not necessarily to your spouse, which everyone appreciates. And that might be all right if you quite like your children. But it does mean that, some money goes to someone who's not your spouse. And from a tax perspective, that will either use up some of the allowance or mean that tax is going to get paid. And I suppose the other thing is, of course, with intestacy rules, you've got it's just your nearest blood relative who inherits. So your lifelong partner or your friends or your favorite charities all get nothing. The other issue I suppose we've got with wills is that a lot of people see it as a bit of a one and done process. So you do your will and, big tick.
Never look at it again.
Sort it. Exactly right. So, we'll come across a lot of people who've got wills that just leave everything, married couple perhaps, leave everything to each other and then to their children. And on some, that's, entry level wills, which for a lot of people, that's fine. But things do change. That might be okay if you're a youngish couple, your primary purpose of making a will is to name guardians for your children, perhaps. That's all okay. But, as circumstances change, your asset base changes, family dynamics change, you've really got to reflect that in your will. So, you might have business assets that you want to make use of business relief. You might be thinking about life interest type arrangements because you're worried that your spouse might remarry after your death, particularly important, I suppose, for people who've been married before. Or you might just have beneficiaries who are, for one reason or another, not quite ready to receive an inheritance yet. They might not be financially mature enough or dare I say, sort of matrimonially secure enough to receive their inheritance. So that you need a slightly more complicated structure. With lifetime trusts, a couple of things to think about with that, and that is you've got to understand the basic premise, which is you're making a gift. You're giving something away. Yeah. So you can't say, well, I've put it into trust, but I can still benefit from it. Well, certainly you can't from a tax perspective, because that won't work. It's a breach of the reservation of benefit rules. So with trust, you appoint trustees. You need at least two, one of which could be you. And the trustees then manage the assets for the beneficiaries and that you've carefully selected. You're creating a new entity, though, and you need to be aware of all that involves. So you've got to think, well, I've got to manage the assets now in a trustee-like, so cautious way, because we can all be as daft as we like with our own money, can't we? We can, put the money on the 330 at Redcar if we want. But if you're a trustee, you can't really do that. The Trustee Act will force you to act more carefully, because you've got to be acting in the best interest of the beneficiary. So you have regular meetings, you've got to produce accounts, you've got to fill in tax returns. In other words, there's administration. And some people sometimes don't take account of that fully.
Yeah. And that's a lot of things to think about. And I hope our advisors are able to work with teams like yours to navigate those issues.
Yeah, exactly right.
So recent rules have mandated that trusts to register with the government's trust registration service. So can you tell us more about this and its implications for both advisors and their clients?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the government has introduced an online trust register, and it's extended its scope now so that it covers nearly all trusts on an ongoing basis. Whether a trust is taxable or not, the government want to know about it. Now, essentially what the register was about, it was introduced as part of the UK's implementation of the fifth money laundering directive to ensure the country's got proper anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing procedures in place. So you can't really criticise the thinking behind it, but it does involve administration. So from the 1st of September 2022, there's quite a lot more that you've got to deal with when you create a trust. So you've got to go online. You have to provide details of the person who's setting up the trust and the trustees and their beneficiaries, their nationalities, their dates of birth, and the interest they've got in the trust. And then, on an ongoing basis, if there's any changes to that, you've got to report those changes within 90 days. From an advisor point of view, that UK service providers are required now to confirm that a trust has been registered before commencing a business relationship. So it's another, it's a bit like anti-money laundering generally, isn't it? Another thing that you've got to ask for, not just someone's passport and driving license or whatever. You've got to go, well, show us the credentials for the trust that's been registered to prove that the government know about it. Yeah, it's clearly having an effect, because there's been a massive surge in registrations. So up to the end of March 2023, there was 462,000 trusts registered. Wow. Whereas in the year before it was only 33,000. So that extension to cover all trusts, whether they pay tax or not, has had a massive effect. A lot of work has had to be done. And I suppose the worrying thing is there's probably a load of trusts out there that have not yet been dealt with. Certainly, we come across them pretty regularly. So trusts, perhaps, where you've got a surviving spouse living in a house on a life interest, because the husband and wife died and said you can stay there for life, and then I want it to go to the kids. That's a trust. It's not producing any income. There's not really any administration involved. No one's thinking that there's a trust there, but there is. That should have been registered as of last September. I suspect some of those will start to come out of the woodwork over the next few years.
And another component of that is also inheritance tax. So it is a significant concern for many clients. So how can financial advisors work with clients to navigate the complexities of IHT, and what are the considerations to keep in mind?
Yeah, well, it is obviously a significant concern, and it's an ever-increasing, or there's an ever-increasing number of clients for whom it's applicable, because that nil rate band allowance for inheritance tax, that's £325,000, has remained the same since 2009. And it doesn't look like it's going up anytime soon. So, as house prices increase and asset values go up, more and more people are falling within that tax net. So certainly this year, from April to September, I think it was about 3.9 billion has been raised through inheritance tax.
Right.
So that's almost half a billion higher than the previous year. I suppose a preliminary point, though, to think about if you're advising someone who's doing their estate planning is just to know their drivers about tax, because I think it's sometimes very easy to jump into assuming that everyone is trying to mitigate tax as much as possible without really finding out about what clients' objectives are. So, for example, if a client says, well, to be honest, I'm just going to give all my money to charity, then there's not an awful lot of point diving through a load of, well, let's go through all your options of inheritance tax planning, because you're not going to have that issue. But for those who do want to consider tax planning, I think it is very important to just bear in mind, get to know the basics, let's know the allowances, let's know those reliefs to make sure that they're maximised. So as I mentioned before, everything that goes to spouse is tax-free. It is spouse, though, not common law spouse. So anything that you leave to married or a registered civil partner is tax-free, as long as that person is UK domiciled. So there's a slight wrinkle there as well. And in addition to the nil rate band, the £325,000 that isn't going up anytime soon, there's the confusingly named residential nil rate band allowance. Okay. So something the government's introduced to try and help with inheritance tax, but then made it as complicated as possible. So an allowance that gives you up to £175,000 worth of extra allowance if you've got a house, if you leave that house to your direct descendants, which I think is government speak for your children, right? And then if your estate's less than £2 million. So there's hoops that you've got to jump through to qualify for that. But again, bearing in mind, if you're doing some planning as a financial advisor, encouraging clients to make sure they hit those criteria will be quite important, because you've got that extra allowance available, and it's transferable between spouses too. So if one doesn't use it, those, both the nil rate band allowance and the residential nil rate band allowance double up. So effectively, a married couple might have an inheritance tax threshold of £1 million if all of the conditions fall right. And remember, it's important to bear in mind that you can make potentially exempt transfers. Okay, in other words, gifts. You give money away, survive 7 years, it's outside your estate. And even if you don't survive 7 years, there is a taper relief that kicks in after 3. But sometimes it is misunderstood. That taper relief will only apply if the amount that you've given away exceeds the nil rate band. So it's only really for bigger gifts that's going to be applicable. The annual exemptions are pretty paltry these days. So £3,000 a year. You don't have to survive 7 years if you give that away. Okay, well, it's not a big amount, is it? You can take it back a year. And then, any number of £250 you can give away, as long as it's to separate individuals. The one that I think sometimes is overlooked, and I think it would be well for advisors just to bear in mind, is because it might mean restructuring investments to take this into account, is the normal expenditure out of income exemption. So again, a bit confusing, but what it's talking about here is if you've got a particular person who has got surplus income, lucky them, right? But they have, maybe, and they regularly give it away, not necessarily the same amount and not necessarily to the same people, but that is immediately exempt. So no surviving 7 years.
Okay.
But you do have to be on top of your records with that, because you might have to prove it. So, you've got to write your letter saying this is what I'm intending to do, so that there's some kind of audit trail, so that can be proved later if need be. And then things that, financial advisors may be more comfortable with, or certainly more within their sphere than in the legal. So pension planning, making sure life insurance is in trust, and talking about investment products that are inheritance tax friendly are all an important part of the tax planning toolkit. And we very often as lawyers have to remember, hang on, we need to make sure we've got financial advisors involved with that, because we can't talk about those things, or we're not qualified to do so. So it's bringing in lawyers and financial advisors to work together that usually produces the best result.
And I want to go back to what you mentioned earlier about asset values and how, especially in real estate and investments, they've been on the rise. So what challenges and opportunities does this present when it comes to wealth transfer and tax planning?
Yeah, I suppose obviously increased asset values mean potentially larger estates.
Mm.
And there may be more scope to, I suppose I was going to say more scope to give things away, more scope to spend more, let's be honest.
Yeah.
It gives you a bit of a choice to do things that you always want to do in life, maybe. But I think you've got to bear in mind that, bigger estates could ultimately mean more tax. And I think that's when good cash flow modeling is key for clients, because if there's a bigger tax bill down the road, then it might be if there's more money in the pot, then you could consider making those gifts a bit earlier than you otherwise would. And if you can sit down with someone and go, well, hang on a minute, let's make sure that I can have some reassurance that if I make this gift, I can still do all the things I want to do for the rest of my life. Then that's an important part of the planning process. A temptation, of course, or the way the tax system is designed with this 7-year rule is to make gifts early in the hope that you can survive 7 years. But that does have to be tempered with making sure that the recipient's at the right stage of life. You could be very clever and say, well, look, I've transferred all this money to my children and save 40%. But if your children then subsequently divorce and lose 50% of it, you've not got a good net result with that. So you just have to make sure that you've got the timing of it right.
Yeah. And with your expertise in wealth transfer and tax, can you provide some practical tips for our listeners, specifically for staying ahead of changes in tax landscape and optimizing wealth transfer strategies?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of estate planning, I think the key really is to think about starting as early as possible and to be flexible in your planning. So obviously keep it under review. Because it's a bit of a cliche, but you shouldn't put all your eggs in a one tax mitigation basket. I suppose you could say at the moment the tax system's quite benign. We know that we can give things away, survive 7 years, and it's outside the estate. But you don't want to leave that too late before you start. Because certainly we come across clients a lot of the time who say, well, I'm going to do that later when I'm a bit older. But I think sometimes we see it that clients reach a stage in life when it's hard to change the mindset. So if you've been looking to build up your wealth over a period of time, working hard, building up your savings, sometimes late on in life, you say, it's difficult to say, right, I've now reached a point where I think I'm comfortable and I can start to divest myself of some money by giving it away. That critical turning point sometimes gets missed. Clearly, if you've got assets with a large gain, you might decide that you are going to put that into trust. So I talked before about creating a lifetime trust. Well, if you've got an asset like a property or some investments with a large capital gain, you might think to yourself, well, I can't just transfer that because I don't want to have to pay the gain on it. Well, as long as the amount that you're talking about is within your nil rate band allowance, so £325,000, you might decide that you'd put that into trust because you can then hold over the gain into a discretionary trust. And that's quite useful for, or it's certainly an idea using a trust like that during lifetimes, an idea that is common for sort of bank of mum and dad type gifts, if I can call it that. So perhaps, parents who want to help their children with their start in life and maybe help with a property purchase. So if you just say to your son or daughter, there you go, here's some money, that's great because it reduces the value of your estate. Good. But maybe you've then you might not be quite so happy if the child then sells the house and runs off with the money and parties in Magaluf till the money runs out, or does mortgages it to the hilt, or transfers it to a partner who you don't particularly like. So there's potential issues with that, and I think that's sometimes where people say, well, can I not just put the money in trust and then the trust can buy the property for the child to live in, which of course you can, but then you would be paying higher stamp duty rates for that. So sometimes the compromise is to say, well, we'll set up a trust, put the money in, and then the trustees, very often yourselves, will decide to lend the money to the children, perhaps interest-free if you really like them, right?
Yeah.
And then the children can buy the property in their own name. It'll be their main residence, so hopefully not quite severe for stamp duty. And then if anything does happen that you don't like, so some kind of matrimonial meltdown with the child, then you can turn around and say, or perhaps it'll be the child actually who encourages you to say, we need you to pay that money back.
Right.
The trustees ask for the money to come back in. Children then sort themselves out, hopefully, and then at some future stage can come back to the trustees and say, is there any chance of another little borrow from the pot?
Mm-hmm.
So that's certainly something that we see quite a lot. And I'm sure there'll be, family lawyers out there saying, well, we could still take assets into account if there's a discretionary trust. But that is true, but at least it offers some protection.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you've had your fair share of real life success stories and case studies. Can you share any that can illustrate the benefits of effective wealth transfer planning and legal counsel?
Yeah, I suppose what a fairly typical example came up relatively recently here at Weightmans, where we had a client who was probably mid-50s, and he ran his own successful trading business, and he was a client of our owner-managed business team who were helping him trying to find a buyer for the business. So he was done. He was ready to take a backward step in terms of his career path. He wanted to stop. He had children in their 20s, but they weren't really keen to take it on. They got their own interests and they wanted to do their own thing. And his concern was inheritance tax. Because as a business owner, he was in quite a fortunate position. He owned shares in a trading business that qualify for 100% business relief. So up until the sale, he's fine. Largely, his biggest asset was covered. Okay,
right.
He got wills that took advantage of that business relief, so all was well. But he was worrying about what happens on post-sale, because post-sale, well, he'll pay some capital gains tax on the sale anyway. But then what? Then he's got what was potentially quite a chunky amount of cash sat in his estate. And yes, he could be spoken to about reinvesting that in other business type assets, but that's not really what he wanted to do. He didn't want to take that risk. He wanted the more comfortable life. Now, fortunately, in this particular case, he did speak to us early enough, because sometimes they're the sort of clients that we get introduced to, the day before the sale, and you go, well, there's not an awful lot you can do now, is there? Or even after the sale. But in this case, there was plenty of time. So what he looked to do was to put some shares, all qualifying for relief, into trust before the sale, with the intention that when the sale goes through, that money then sits in the trust and not in his name. So he's ring-fenced some of the money essentially for his children. So they're outside of his estate. With the sale proceeds, he also, because he was, still had plenty, more than he needed, he decided he would set up a family investment company. So a company structure where he gave the children different classes of shares that he was still in control of. And then he could decide whether to give them dividends in the future or not, depending on what mood he was in, and also what stage the children were at, I suppose, in life. So he managed to transition himself from being a business owner to a non-business owner without quite the dramatic inheritance tax bump that some people experience, or the risk of it. We then spoke to his parents, because his parents were comfortably off. Not as well off as he was going to be, but all right. And we spoke to them and said, well, what are you doing with your estate planning? And surprise, they were leaving it to their son, right, who was just selling a business. Well, is that a good idea? Because he's busily trying to get himself out of this inheritance tax hole, and you're going to give him a load of money. And he was aware that he could do a variation if they did pass away and leave it to him. But a better alternative would be just for them to address it in the first place. So what they're doing is changing their wills. And they're saying, well, and we've had that conversation. Do you want to just leave it directly to the grandchildren? Which they were quite keen to do. Or their son is saying, well, I'll put it in trust for the grandchildren, because that's a little bit more, got a little bit more protection to it. And then interestingly, we spoke to the children, okay, because they're in the 20s. On the face of it, they could be wealthy people, right? And we just wanted to have a chat to them about their plans. So we wanted to put a will in place, unusual for 20-year-olds, but certainly if you've got a level of wealth, or really anything, you should be thinking about wills at that age too. So they talked about wills, and then with a little bit of encouragement from parents, and they were a bit reluctant to talk about it, but we had to talk about things like cohabitation agreements and prenuptial arrangements, because, dad might not have been so keen to transfer things to them if he thought there might be a risk in the future.
Yeah.
So kind of it was a whole family conversation, and I think that sort of intergenerational planning is really the key to these things. If people can talk and openly about it and have a conversation, and everyone feels that they're involved in the plan, I think that produces the best results.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like having that whole cohesive and making sure that there's open communication is the most important thing in those cases.
Yeah, because I mean, we often come across people who, parents who set up, perhaps in their will, set up trusts for their children.
And they have no idea?
Well, they don't talk to the children about it. So the children feel a bit aggrieved because they pass away and go, oh, we've been left nothing. Well, you kind of have. It's in a trust. And then the children, either are the trustees themselves or they speak to the trustees and say, we don't get this. We don't like it. Don't like it. Get rid of it. So, and they've usually got the power to do that. They get rid of it, wind it up. And then 3 or 4 years later, they go, suddenly understand why that trust was put in place now.
Yeah.
But it's too late then. It's gone. They can't create their own trust because they can't benefit from their own. So it just seemed a bit of a shame in those situations where that conversation's not happened so that the parent tells the child what's on the agenda.
Yeah. And I wonder if you have any idea of any upcoming changes or trends in the legal and financial landscape that advisors should be prepared for when assisting their clients with wealth transfer and estate planning. I mean, obviously, we have the potential of a general election at some point and a new government, which could, change a lot. But
absolutely, and I'll come back to those. But I think first of all, I think it's worth just thinking about sort of the demographic shift that's happening as well at the moment. Yeah. So, there is an increase in the older population. I think the census a couple of years ago said that people over 65 had increased by 2 million pounds 2 million in the UK. The baby boomer generation are reaching retirement phase of their life. And generally speaking, and I appreciate there's exceptions, but you might say overall they're doing okay financially. They'll typically be homeowners. They might have nice pension provisions, so they're kind of set for retirement. The younger generation, however, have got a slightly different financial backdrop. They might find it difficult to get on the property ladder. They may have more career paths that are a bit more wiggly rather than job for life. They may have.
You're talking about me.
Well, I don't know your background, but they might have a financial outlook that's a little bit different from the generation above. So there may be a cultural gap that's not just technology based. There may just be, well, hang on a minute. Yes, investments are important, but I want to know what the impact of those investments are, rather than just what's the overall maximum financial return I can get from it. And I think that sort of different perspective does need to be thought through when you're thinking about the generational wealth transfer. But yet, in terms of what might change in the future, clearly, we've got a budget before an election, haven't we? So there has course of
jumped forward.
Yeah, it's okay. There's talk. We don't know, but there's talk, isn't there? There's newspaper campaigns. There's all kinds of going about inheritance tax.
Yeah.
So, for the first time and only time in my 30-year career so far, and inheritance tax is actually making the press as an interesting thing to talk about. Whether that happens, I don't know. I mean, inheritance tax brings in £7 billion a year. So if there's no inheritance tax, where does that money come from?
Yeah.
Is there something else? Do we get rid of inheritance tax?
And
which would be interesting. Yeah, and it'd be interesting politically, wouldn't it? Because you might say, well, what proportion of the population actually pays inheritance tax? It's probably relatively small. So I don't know how that's going to pan out. But it may well be that becomes a manifesto pledge or whatever. Difference if there's a change of government. Are we then going to be saying, well, actually, we quite like the redistribution of wealth that inheritance tax brings in? So it is very much difficult to plan for, and what changes will happen to pensions, because they always seemingly get changed whenever there's a budget or a change in government.
Yeah.
Again, pensions a very useful way of trying to plan for inheritance tax at the moment, but who knows what the rules were going to be. So I think in some ways it's just we know what the score is now, so why don't we take advantage of whatever we know now, and then we'll just if our plans are flexible and we're thinking about them all the time, we'll have to adapt them as and when the rules change.
Yeah. So flexibility is key.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And finally, are there any resources or tools that you would recommend for our listeners to stay updated and informed in this ever-evolving field?
Yeah, well, if you can excuse the shameless plug.
I love a plug.
Yeah, well, the Weightmans Services for Individuals newsletter is available, which can keep you up to date. You can subscribe for that at weightmans.com. On top of that, though, I think it's right to point out that the revenue, so HMRC, have got a Trust and Estates newsletter, which is pretty good and comprehensive. The latest edition of that's got an awful lot on the trust registration service at the moment.
Okay.
And then also, from my perspective, I'm also a member of STEP, so the Society of Trust and Estate Practitioners, which is a global professional body covering lawyers and accountants as well as financial advisors, all with the aim of helping families plan for the future. And they set standards and do educational courses and publish articles and journals, which are all very good. So I would encourage listeners to find out a bit more about STEP.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today, Richard. I think you just gave so much of your own expertise and had so many interesting stories to tell. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to In Conversation With. We do hope that you enjoyed it. Please do keep up to date with all our new releases via Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you get your podcasts from. You can also keep up to date with all our new content published on the Money Marketing website, as well as our print edition Money Marketing magazine. So make sure to subscribe. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. See you next time.